I think Bitcoin is, if someone comes for you, they can't mess with you in the same way they can with cash. So I think it's very useful, and I think it's hopeful for liberty moving forward. I think these city-states are going to be powered by Bitcoin, powered by just similar type things that take, as you said, money out of the state's hands.
Multiple generations that have owned a castle or some part of land, but there's no income from that. So now they own this land, they own this castle, they can't even afford to keep it up. What happened there?
Huge blocks of land going on an illiquid market for asset that no one wants. And it wiped out the estates. But there's no land to fund it because it's all been taxed away. And the problem with those taxes was it was the nominal value of the land, not the income it produced. So when they're not producing income and you have to sell the whole thing, the estate's just decayed. It takes the assets out of the old owners who kind of cared about it for the future and puts it in the hands of people who don't really care. They're going to put a solar farm on top of it that's going to poison the agricultural land. And that's what we're seeing now.
I think about sometimes, like, certainly we've sent the middle class over to China. We could bring those jobs back, but wouldn't that be akin to putting people in the field to pick cotton and strawberries? They're low-paying jobs today. How much would you say it's just times changed, technology has shifted that?
I think what you want, though, is you want more of those domestic jobs being produced because not everyone can succeed in the knowledge economy. And I think to have a thriving internal market, you need jobs for people different ways up the ladder. But you also don't want to stifle domestic innovation by letting people who have other interests take advantage of your market. You'd probably want to look at something about a new amendment for voting where only net taxpayers could vote. I mean, preferably we're not going to have the income tax, but if we are...
All right, Will Tanner, thanks so much for joining me today. Super happy to have you here, and it's been a little bit of trouble, but I'm glad we're here. We're going to do this show. You have been writing about history in a way that's super fascinating, and most fascinating for me are the parallels that history has with sort of what the world seems to be going through right now. So I want to talk about that. The way that you're able to connect these dots is amazing. Start with a big frame. I guess, what kind of big parallels do you see with some of the stuff you're writing about in history and today?
Yeah, there are a couple things, and it's all kind of interesting seeing the pattern repeat. One big thing, and this kind of ties in with one of the points I use a lot, is for whom does society exist? Is it for the productive? Is it for the best? Is it for the people who need the most help? I think recently we've seen it be for the people who need the most help, which has its advantages and disadvantages, but is a big change from 20th century, 18th century, 19th century Western history. And it's existed before, but it's rare. And if you get into why, I think the pattern you really see in this thing that's relevant and happens a lot is egalitarianism, or this belief that there's no difference in human capability between people or between people groups, and that if any difference does present itself, it's the job of the government to come in and crush it with whatever amount of force or regulation is necessary. So you see that in the French Revolution, you see that in England in the late 19th century, and you see that really in America starting in perhaps the 60s or 70s, but then really ramping up in the 2000s. So I think we're in one of those patterns where it's the battle of egalitarianism or hyper-egalitarianism versus human capability, and technology gives us such ways to express ourselves and show differences in human capability. We're really seeing that struggle now, and I think it's a struggle we've seen before.
You referenced mostly sort of newer history, French Revolution and forward. So does that seem to be more a symptom of like affluence? Like maybe when you've sort of gotten rid of the base needs, that then those types of things become an issue?
I think I just happen to reference more modern history because there's so many more sources that are far easier to read.
Okay.
If you want a more ancient example, and I think you're right that affluence makes this a bigger deal where it presents itself more frequently, but if you want an older example, you can look at the egalitarianism under despotism of the pre-Indo-European European societies. Cthul Hayuk, I think is how you pronounce it, is one of the more famous ones, but everyone just lived in these horrid favela-like worlds, these cramped cities where disease was rife and spread quickly. And the invaders that stamped a lot of that out were very hierarchical. And it was this centuries-long battle between the two groups with this pastoralist society from the steppe, which we've seen in history repeat itself a lot, win, and the hierarchy that it carried with it win, and the sky god it carried with it win. Or would these despotisms, and other than the king at the top, the egalitarian society completely beneath him, is that what would win? So we've seen the fight before, but I think you're right that affluence both makes the cycles quicker and makes it a little bit easier to see.
Yeah. Seems like maybe once you're not so concerned about having enough food to live, for example, then you can start to worry about other people, right? And if they're equal as you are, right? I want to pull on some of these threads, but I want to go back maybe a little bit in time. So obviously, you're super knowledgeable about this. You write about this, and I'm curious why. Is it because you're just interested and curious, or is it because you see like maybe there's lessons that we can learn and we could benefit from? I'm curious sort of how you got started diving down these deep history rabbit holes and specifically why.
Yeah, it was very random. When I was a teenager, I don't know if you've ever heard of Soldier Fortune magazine, but it was...
Oh, Soldier of Fortune, yes.
Yeah, it was kind of like a military magazine. But the guy who founded it, I think his name's Robert Brown, wrote a memoir that I found in Barnes & Noble when I was just kind of plodding around looking for something to do, and read it. And he mentioned Rhodesia in it, which is a country I'd never heard of before. So I went and started reading about it and kept reading about it. And I noticed that there's this country that was, relatively free and prosperous, and really the only difference between it and the countries that weren't destroyed during this decolonization push was that it was relatively hierarchical and non-egalitarian. Rights were respected for all, but it was a different society formation than we really see elsewhere in the West now. And so that got me interested, and I kind of kept reading about it out of personal interest. But then I started to notice that if you look at the problems America faces now, the things that really made life just awful in 2020 and 2021 for a lot of people, it was this refusal to recognize nature and recognize that different people have different capabilities that should be cherished and strengthened to the best of our ability, but certainly have to be recognized, I think. So I started reading more about decolonization in Africa because of that, because it's one of these really stark examples of seeing this just collapse happen, and we know why, and we have all the data why, because it's very modern and very recent. It was all cataloged and seen. And that's how I also got into the old world, because I noticed that why did the English Empire decline? Why did it collapse? It was this magnificent empire that lifted people out of poverty and squalor for centuries, and at one point covered, I think, a quarter of the world's surface. And then at the point where its decline began, it was gone within a couple decades. So what happened there? And I noticed many of the same trends that happened in southern Africa, particularly Rhodesia, happened in England as well. And then at the same time, you saw these mass riots, just things on fire, and politicians having this very odd way, I thought, of talking about it. And so kind of sensed the commonalities and thought it might be helpful to get deeper into why these collapses happened and in what ways they relate to the American experience.
When you go back even further, I mean, is it the same things that you see repeating even back to like the Roman Empire? And is it sort of like this 250-year lifespan of an empire or democracy, something like that?
Yeah, maybe. I think in some ways it is. The looting of the treasury phase of democracy or a decayed republic is certainly something that plays out very frequently. And we see that in America, we see it in Greece, we see it in Rome. And same with, I kind of pithily call it democracy's tendency to choose Barabbas, which is from the story of Christ, where Barabbas was chosen by the crowd over Christ when Pilate asked who the crowd wanted to free. And you see that in Athens, for example, where they chose Alcibiades' just terrible expedition to Sicily that really ended Athens as this important city-state because Sparta defeated it because of that. So you see democracy making bad decisions frequently and ending empires because of it, which is very relevant to America. I do think, though, that what we call the Enlightenment and this kind of birth of liberalism as a political force did change things somewhat, because if you look at, say the War of Spanish Succession in 1700, there's not this ideological bent to it about egalitarianism or about leveling. And similarly, if you go back to Rome, they had conflicts with the Germans and didn't see the barbarians on the steppe as their equals. But it wasn't this ideological fight. It was just a fight. As you were talking about earlier, it's a fight for survival. Whereas in the post-French Revolution, post-mid-1700s world, there's this ideology of leveling that's attendant to a lot of conflict, and I think is very hard to detach from it. And though that impulse has existed before, I think the dominance of it as an ideology and something to which just so many people in positions of power are attached is something relatively new. It makes this era different from ones that preceded it.
Yeah. You said that democracy ends a lot of times because of bad decisions. Is that, I think you had written a piece talking about, was it maybe Socrates and how they had thought about a democracy? And I think you likened it to, how could you vote for a captain of a ship if you know nothing about sailing? Was that your writing?
I don't think so.
But you talk about democracy ending because of bad decisions. And so is that where you have sort of ruled by the mobs, but the uneducated mobs who are uneducated and don't understand the situations? Like, so for example, in this last presidential election in the United States, maybe one of the top issues was inflation, for example. Most people have zero idea about inflation or what causes it. So then how do you vote for somebody to fix inflation if you don't even understand what the situation is that has caused it?
Right. One thing that comes up when you mention that, and I'll get to your point in 1 second, and this just reminds me of it. If you say, well, perhaps there's some people who, because they've been bred to rule, they might do a better job at governing, at least on the edges, at least comparatively to the average. And people say, well, there's reversion to the mean. It's hard to do this over time because everyone just reverts to the mean. And in some ways that's true. You revert to the mean of your ancestors. But do racehorses revert to the mean of donkeys? No. If they do, it's very rare. And so I think that's something you run into with democracy as a system, is because there's no guidelines on who can vote. And Athens at least had a system where if you proposed a law, you did it with a noose around your neck, because if the changes to their current laws were voted down and you proposed it, you'd be hanged, because they didn't want this constant turmoil of law suggestion, which we, of course, don't have. And so republics combined some of the old benefits of aristocracy with some of the other benefits of democracy, which I think there's a great mix there, and America did it quite well for a period. But mass democracy has this problem where the worst will always outweigh the best if their votes are all equal. And that's something you really don't want. You want to have some limitation that it keeps the vote, or keeps the ability to steward the wealth and prosperity and future of the nation in the hands of people who I think have shown the ability to steward things personally. Rhodesia did that with property voting, as America and Britain did up until the 1830s. I don't think it has to be hereditary, but it does certainly need to be limited to people who have shown a personal ability to have the qualities that you want of the qualities of the people in charge. I know that I kind of jumbled right at the end. But.
And maybe it's more than that. It's even skin in the game. It's incentive systems, if you will, right? So like, I used to live in a gated neighborhood. I didn't really like the rules they had, so I moved out of the gated neighborhood, but I don't get a vote in that gated neighborhood anymore. Or if I went and rented a home in that neighborhood, I don't get a vote because I don't own the home. I'm just renting a home in that neighborhood. And so I have no incentive system, or I'm not incentivized to keep that neighborhood up. So I wouldn't want to pay to increase the rates because I don't care what the streets look like, for example. I don't care if it brings home values down since I don't own a home in that area. So you're talking about some sort of a system like that would incentivize that?
Right. And as a skin in the game example, Rishi Sunak is the former Prime Minister of Britain, who did a very bad job of it, is probably the charitable way of putting it. He's now considering just coming to America and going back to being a banker here because he's done with politics in England. And I think if you're a leader who can destroy the country and then just leave and go back to having a normal career someone else, he never really had skin in the game. How his policies played out, or her policies played out, didn't really matter. So kind of whatever could happen. It didn't matter. There's no need to steward things. There's no need to plan ahead. Whereas, when it was the aristocracy or the gentry running things in 1830, if they did something that was so bad it caused a revolution, they were going to have to deal with that. And all their wealth was tied up in a given county. So they'd be done if something bad happened. And so you see, I think, much more reasonable decision-making and much more planning for the long term, this ability to plant trees in the shade of which you'll never sit, but your grandchildren will. That's one of the hallmarks of Western civilization, and it's something that the high time preference of mass democracy really just erodes. So yes, I think you do need a way to have skin in the game for the long term that mass democracy as a system generally doesn't provide.
The high time preference of democracy, specifically around sort of like a 2-year, 4-year cycle, where I'm here for 2 years or 4 years, let's see what I could do. So maybe I get voted in back again, maybe I don't.
Right. And you see this in other areas of life, and some America too. CEO pay is a great example. How many just horror stories have we heard of CEOs having their compensation based on very short-term metrics? So then they get this huge golden parachute, but the company just is destroyed in the long run. General Electric is one famous example. They're kind of the oil boom of the early 2000s is another with how that played out. But you see that just on a grander scale in democratic politics, where people don't have to plan for the long term, so they don't. They plan for the election cycle you mentioned, which is very deleterious, I think, to our country.
When you think about, I think you'd written about sort of like when you look into the long lens of history, it's typically sort of powerful men that drive that influence, right? So whether that might have been old powerful men, as in fighting ability, for example, ability to conquer, they drove sort of that policy shift. Today, you might argue that we still have powerful men driving things, but now it's more like soft power, right, through politics, but even also through money. I'm curious how you think about that powerful men driving that narrative and how that shifted over time and why that matters.
I mean, it certainly shifted. There's one, I find it very funny anecdote about this. Around the first decade of the 20th century, the prime minister in England was Lloyd George, and he was creating a large number of peerages, which are the aristocratic titles for different merchants and bankers and people in England who wanted one and had donated a lot to his party. And the old lord, one of the people who had arrived with William the Conqueror and the Conquest about 1,000 years before, approached him in the House of Lords and was berating him for this. And Lord George, who didn't know the man's background, said, "Well, where did you get your title? What did your family do?" And when Lord George said, "Where did you get your title?" the Lord looked at him and said, "With the battle axe, sir, with the battle axe." And left it there. So it's kind of a funny story, but it does.
Who gave you the authority? This
Yes.
does right here.
Yes, we still have it on the wall at home. I can show you. And that's a different type of authority because, for one, that elite isn't just a rentier class. It has a purpose, and that's military leadership, which it did largely exercise around the end of the Boer War, perhaps when that ended. But there's this long history of suffering and fighting and bearing the brunt of the country's foreign adventures that had existed for 1,000 years, and they continued to exercise. So then when they're considering policies, they have skin in the game regarding that, both at home with land and taxes, and then abroad with having to be the ones who are going to go fight in Sudan or wherever. And that's a different system. Whereas that started to shift, as the story shows, towards this merchant class that certainly brought a great degree of prosperity to the country, and certainly did America, men like J.P. Morgan or Rockefeller. But it's a different sort of person, and the skin in the game, because the instruments are so financialized and somewhat made up, or at least it's not a real asset, it's an abstracted one. Their power and their wealth is somewhat different, where they have a different conception of the state of the country, the state of prosperity, and what their duties are, if any, to their fellow citizens. And I think that's really the big shift you see over time, and it happens again and again, is this old landed elite kind of rule? Is it going to be the Rome of the patricians and the Equites, or the Britain of the lords and gentry, or the America of the Virginia gentry that existed for a long time? Or is it going to be a country of merchants and bankers that are very successful, but certainly have different priorities and different priors that they bring to the table? And it's a shift you see repeatedly, and I think we saw it in the 20th century.
So do you think it's a difference in the type of wealth that they have? So you mentioned sort of like Rishi Sunak, who just can move and can potentially just take his wealth with him because, whatever it's in the markets, as opposed to the class of the old who really had it tied up in the land. So if they got driven off the land, they had no more assets. And so today you have this sort of oligarchy, if you will, but they sort of have this wealth that's like global wealth, and they could just kind of go wherever. And do you think that's sort of like one of the main things that really changes the skin of the game, if you will, on that?
Mm-hmm. I think that's certainly part of it. And I think kind of the other aspect of it is if you look at how wealth was measured in, say, 1800, and the novels of Jane Austen are great for this, it wasn't the capital value of whatever asset was, whether bonds or land or anything. It was the income it produced, because that's what the person who held it could live off of. And then because they didn't have to worry about having an income, they could serve the state and were expected to do so, whether it was in parliament or the military. America, similarly with Congress and military. That died around the same time the shift transitioned, and now we never hear about someone's income unless it's just some ridiculous situation. Instead, we hear about the nominal value of their capital wealth.
Right.
And I think what's implied by that is that it's going to be sold. Because, if it's, I think Amazon doesn't pay a dividend. If you have Amazon stock, you might have a huge nominal wealth, but you're going to have to sell it to get anything out of that. And if you're selling it, that means it's not permanent. Of course, I think the exception are bearer assets like Bitcoin, because hopefully you don't want to sell those, right, or gold. But, if it's a financial asset that's not producing a yield or it's not producing income from it, you have to sell it. And as such, your time horizons are not infinite. They're not for, 7 generations down the line. It's instead a much shorter timeline. It's, what's going to happen in the next year or two, because I'm going to need to think about this. And I think that is something we see with our elite is, Nancy Pelosi will make a stock trade that everyone hears about, or Dan Crenshaw will do the same and everyone will hear about it.
Yeah.
And they never focus on the dividends of the companies they trade. They're just trading them based on political events. And I think we see that a lot. It's this short-termism that's inculcated by the way wealth was measured and the global nature of it.
Although you have, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk being the richest man in the world because he didn't sell his stock or trade his stock, and he has just owned it. Although there are stories of Musk kind of being broke and having no money at all, right? I've seen stories of that. And then you have, on the other side, you have, not so much in the U.S., as well, but maybe over in England as well, as like maybe multiple generations that have owned a castle or some part of land, but there's no income from that. So now they own this land, they own this castle, they can't even afford to keep it up. So is that because the wealth has shifted away from that type of asset, or what happened there?
That's a really interesting story. That was one of the changes that happened at the end of the 19th century. Two things kind of came to a head. One was the opening of the American Midwest. We don't really think about it in these terms, but if you look at what the prairie was in, say, 1870, it was this virgin territory with 14, 15 feet of incredibly fertile topsoil where you didn't need fertilizers. You could just plow it and plant grain. And also railroads meant that you could take that grain anywhere. Steamships, railroads, it could go from Kansas to Britain in the relative blink of an eye. So this entire half of a continent was open up to grain growing. And I promise this get into your question. It's got agriculture history. But all this grain was grown, and the same thing was happening in the Ukrainian region of the Russian Empire to a lesser extent. And it's all this grain from this incredibly fertile soil, which meant the cost of production was near zero. Because of steam and rail, the cost of transportation was near zero. So anywhere that up to this point had some degree of struggle, or at least had to care about how they grew things, could now just import it. There's so much grain that they could just import where people could be fed and prices were low, which was good because it fed people. The problem was without tariffs, which were called corn laws and died out around the end of the 1840s in England and kind of similarly elsewhere. Although Prussia, anyway, England, I think, is a great example because it got rid of its corn laws. So its agricultural market was open. And in the 1870s, grain starts pouring into England, particularly the end of the end of the 70s. And it sets up this agricultural depression because what the traditional tenant system was, there's a tenant farmer who rented a, say, 300-acre farm from the lord who owned, say, 3,000 acres. And the tenant would pay rent to the lord and then keep the rest of the profits from the farm. That worked pretty well when grain was a reasonable price. When it became super cheap because of imports, the farms died. Both the farmers just had no ability to grow anything for profit anymore, and the lords, who up to that point had been renting the land and then serving in the military or parliament, no longer had any rents to draw on, so they started having to sell things. Their time horizons became shorter. And paired with that were death taxes, because up to this point, death taxes had been pretty much gone. They're really briefly revived under Napoleon, but because they're one of the most hated taxes of the medieval system, just caused barons' wars, caused all this trouble, the governments had gotten rid of them. They came back around the turn of the century. Winston Churchill and Lloyd George were largely responsible for that. And Britain and America just followed suit with Wilson. And death taxes meant that now, when you died, you started going to have to sell land. But land wasn't worth as much because of the Depression. And so it's this huge blocks of land going on an illiquid market for an asset that no one wants. And it wiped out the estates. It's kind of my point. So you have these grand country houses, Highclere, Chatsworth. Highclere was falling apart before Downton Abbey. But there's no land to fund it because it's all been taxed away. And the problem with those taxes was it was the nominal value of the land, not the income it produced. So when they're not producing income and you have to sell the whole thing, the estate's just decayed. It takes the assets out of the old owners who kind of cared about it for the future and puts it in the hands of people who don't really care. They're going to put a solar farm on top of it that's going to poison the agricultural land. And that's what we're seeing now. So yeah, they were just taxed away in the Depression and knocked them out. It's the unintended consequences of these policies.
And that's what we see in the U.S. today, right? Where it's like, to your point, they're putting solar panels on the land, which makes it more valuable. But if you want to farm it, you can't make enough income to pay the taxes.
Right. The American equivalent, one of the closest ones, is if you look at the Main Street the main street of these towns in the Midwest that used to be these thriving industrial hubs, whether it was producing lead pipe or wing nuts or shoes or whatever it was, all of that got outsourced because of free trade and these different policies. So now where it used to be, there's a relatively prosperous upper class that owned the factories, middle class that kind of did the administration of them, and working class that worked in them. All of that was just obliterated by these policies. So now what used to be these thriving little towns that led to human flourishing, which I think is the end goal of civilization within them, oh, well, now there are just, some people do fentanyl there, and otherwise there's tumbleweeds going through. It's really horrific.
How much of that is policy versus just technology? So if you think about technology going back right through history, it's always sort of changed the way that we work and communicate and organize, changes the balance of power, all of those things, right? So like you have the Industrial Revolution that brought people into cities and factories, and then you had, Henry Ford created the assembly line, which created this massive middle class, everybody sort of equal on an assembly line almost.
Right.
So then you created this mass management system to manage everybody like a cog in a wheel. Then you created like a mass government structure to manage all of that. So you have this massive middle class because everybody was sort of equal, putting their cog on the wheel. But now we've sort of gone from the industrial age to the information age, right? And so now we certainly those low-paying industrial jobs have gone overseas to lower-paying workers. But in the information age, it allows knowledge workers to excel faster because some people are just smarter. It's not egalitarian, right? And so I think about sometimes, like, certainly we've sent the middle class over to China. We could bring those jobs back, but wouldn't that be akin to putting people in the field to pick cotton and strawberries? They're low-paying jobs today, right? And so how much of it was, some of it was policy for sure, but how much would you say it's just times changed, technology has shifted that?
So I think there are two issues there. One, you're definitely right that the current knowledge economy empowers the people who are able to take advantage of that, which is good, and I think a good thing generally, because people are able to do these things they wouldn't have been able to do before. It costs next to nothing to start a business now, which is very good and has empowered a lot of people. So I think you're right on that. There are just these changes. I think the other side, though, is that we still need steel. We still need natural gas. We still need oil. In some places, these companies are able to thrive. Germany, up until the kind of recent unpleasantness, had a thriving industrial sector alongside its other thriving sectors. And I think what you get there, or what you got in, say, 1900 in America with McKinley, are policies meant to protect the innovative companies that produce these things. So Nucor is a steel maker in America that is much more efficient than U.S. Steel. They use electric arc weld, or they use electricity rather than coal, essentially, for their production of steel, from what I understand. And it makes them very competitive with the Chinese market, say. So whereas U.S. Steel just got hammered by these Chinese imports, Nucor has been able to hold on and do reasonably well. I think what you want, though, is you want more of those domestic jobs being produced, because not everyone can succeed in the knowledge economy. And I think to have a thriving internal market, you need jobs for people different ways up the ladder. So you don't want these legacy companies just being zombie companies and holding on because of tariffs and drawing in resources that they shouldn't be. But you also don't want to stifle domestic innovation by letting people who have other interests take advantage of your market. Like when China, for example, is subsidizing its steel sector so that the price can be much lower than whatever America, without those subsidies, can produce. I think that creates a problem. So I think both sides of it are true. I think you want to protect domestic innovation without just turning things stagnant, which is a tough line to walk, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, which gets to a bigger question I want to ask you, which we'll get to, which is sort of where do we go from here? But as I think through this, I think about some of these things, and I constantly kind of keep going back to sort of like the government just getting too big. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of these functions seem to be, or some of these maybe unintended consequences seem to be a consequence of just the government just being too big. But then to the point that you're talking about of like, well, how do we think about policies that can protect these companies and these industries? And then that just, again, keeps the government sort of getting big. I want to come back to that, though, because you write a lot about Rhodesia. As you said, that was sort of your spark that got you going to where you're at today. What do you see in Rhodesia maybe sort of being like a microcosm of maybe where we're at today, and maybe what are some of the lessons that is it just lessons that sort of show where we're going, like on a downward trajectory, or is there maybe some lessons of how we can turn things around?
Yeah, I think there's actually a great lesson in how things can function, and it's the opposite of Rhodesia is Singapore. So as I talked about Rhodesia earlier, the thing to keep in mind is that Lee Kuan Yew did the opposite of all this, and now Singapore is one of the most thriving places in the world. So
would you also throw like Dubai into that?
I think it's somewhat different in that its wealth was pumped out of the ground. I think
Dubai, less than 1% of GDP comes from oil.
Really?
less than 1% of GDP. I was recently over there. I spoke at the Bitcoin conference there in December, first time I went there, and I posted something on Twitter that got me crucified. I didn't know you couldn't say nice things about Dubai. And being in LA, it's a complete war zone. And I just said, hey, it's just interesting because I had all these preconceived notions of Dubai. I'd never been there. And so I had these preconceived notions. And when I got there, I have to say it's the most magnificent city I've ever seen. I've never seen anything like it. The whole thing's brand new, 20 years old, the most technological advanced, the biggest fountain, the tallest building, all these things. But I just made a post and I said, it's interesting coming from LA, which has the highest taxes in the nation, the worst infrastructure in the nation, and not a single crane in the sky. You can tell a lot about a city by the development. And Dubai has no taxes, the cleanest and best infrastructure I've ever seen in my life, and cranes everywhere. And then, of course, I got a million comments crucifying me. Oh, you should go live there. You want to live under a dictator. You must want gay people to die, you know. Yeah, because everyone's there slaves, and yeah, because they stole all the oil. So anyway, I had to go look it up. Yeah, less than 1% comes from oil. They have no income taxes. They have corporate taxes of 9%. Over if you make over a certain amount. But they sort of did what Singapore did, was just outcompete. But anyway, we'll table that. Sorry to take you down that rabbit hole, but
no, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it was, and again, it took me going there to like I said, challenge all the things. Like one thing I look at, like a major problem that Europe has, as well as America, was like this immigration problem. But 90% of people in the UAE are all immigrants.
Yeah.
Well, it's a different system. There's a lot there. There's a different system, of course. Let's get back to kind of the Rhodesia and the Singapore example.
Yeah, so the UAE or the Dubai might be a great example of kind of the Singapore strategy then, because what I think about Singapore versus Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, the big differences are pragmatic policies that are going to embrace human flourishing for the citizens of the country embraced, or are they just hated if they don't line up with ideology. Lee Kuan Yew was non-ideological. He just wanted Singapore to succeed. And so you see this strange mix of like McKinley-style policies with non-first world leadership and some priors that are very interesting, where he's going to these conferences in Africa, post-colonial Africa, but then, you know, really doing first world stuff at home. As his autobiography is titled Third World to First, kind of sums it up. So it's very pragmatic, works with the Chinese, works with the Americans. It's this mix of stuff that just whatever he needs to do. And so Singapore is a huge success story because of that. He embraced this pragmatism. Rhodesia, on the other hand, under the Ian Smith government, very much did that and worked with everyone to the degree it could. But then Mugabe did not. He famously just destroyed the country by seizing the white farms. And
is that in Zimbabwe?
Yes, so Zimbabwe. So Rhodesia became called Zimbabwe when Mugabe was elected in 1980 in a very corrupt election.
But, so Rhodesia was a colony of the UK?
Kind of. It's an interesting story. So Jamestown, as you probably know, was a company colony. The subscriptions were raised with the Virginia Company to make Jamestown.
Okay.
Rhodesia was somewhat similar. Cecil Rhodes was this big promoter of the British Empire. And he both wanted a railroad from the Cape to Cairo, so from South Africa to Egypt, and needed the middle of Africa to do that, and also just thought it was a good thing for the English Empire to expand because of the benefits for everyone involved, both for raising up the natives and for providing more resources and export markets for the home market. So he saw that there was this vast tract of territory north of South Africa that was almost unpopulated. There had been some large wars amongst the Africans that meant the population was very low. And the population that was there was largely welcoming to British settlement. I forget the name of the chief, but it was the Ndebele tribe was in charge at the time. And they welcomed the British, more or less. So Rhodes put together this company called the British South Africa Company that, using largely funding from England and then men gathered in England and South Africa. And he was looking for men of higher quality than you might expect. There weren't many pirate types. Sent them into Rhodesia to settle the land. And he was really hoping both to settle it so that it was a stable colony where he could put a railroad through it, and that they'd find gold, because at the time the Rand mines in South Africa were just producing this huge flood of gold that helped the world economy a good bit and made the owners fabulously wealthy. So Rhodes wanted that to happen again in Rhodesia. He struck out on the gold. There wasn't much there. But they did find the land was very fertile, and it was very great for growing tobacco. So Rhodesia became this company-owned, essentially agricultural and to a lesser degree mining settlement. where these large estates were built up because there's no history of agriculture there, at least any real degree. So unlike Britain, where farms were constrained by, say, the 300 acres and all the fences of stone surrounding it, it made really doing anything on a mechanical scale difficult. In Rhodesia, there's no one there, so you could just use a tractor and go from horizon to horizon back and forth, and you could really take advantage of the efficiency. So it became this hugely successful agricultural colony where their main export was tobacco and to a lesser degree wheat and cattle. And so under British South Africa Company, it thrived until 1921 when it became self-governing and the company was no longer in charge.
Okay. And then it continued on self-governing until Mugabe came and turned it back into Zimbabwe in the 80s?
Yeah, so it remained part of the Commonwealth until 1965. What happened then was, so from 1920 to 1965, it continued attracting settlement, it had very strict immigration quality controls because it only wanted people who would integrate to the local environment to move there. So they're very strict, and not a ton of people flooded in, but enough to build it up as an economy. The problem was that Britain, after the mid-50s, was very hostile to its empire. It wanted to shed it. It wanted mass democracy to rule in place of kind of European-directed and led government. So first Kenya fell apart, and a lot of the empire started to decay. But then the Belgians, who owned the Congo, gave it up to the Congolese. And what followed was just a parade of horrors that are just absolutely awful, particularly the Simba Rebellion, which was in like 62, 63, maybe 64, I can't quite remember. But in the early 60s, it was just like all the Belgian nuns in the Congo were killed by these rebels, along with a lot of Congolese villagers. There are just these huge humanitarian catastrophes. And so the Rhodesians looked at the Congo and said, well, we don't want to do that. We don't want to turn into this just anarchic hellhole. We want a stable, responsible government. They called it responsible government. And the British said, well, no, you need mass democracy. If you're going to remain part of the empire or detach yourself from it, we want mass democracy. We want local rule, not white rule in Rhodesia, which was a problem because the African chiefs who inside Rhodesia directed much of the black political power and general functioning and administration agreed with Ian Smith, who was the prime minister of Rhodesia at the time, that really you need this responsible government system the Rhodesians had built up, which was a property voting one, as I hinted at earlier. It wasn't apartheid like in South Africa. There weren't these strict racial rules. There weren't really any racial rules except for schooling. And for politics, for voting, it was simply that to vote in the national list, the A list, you needed to have the modern equivalent of about $60,000 of Rhodesian property. So whether that was a farm, whether it was a house, dock in a Rhodesian company, whatever. You just needed that to be able to vote in a national election. And they found that screened out the people who couldn't make good decisions. And were pretty successful in doing it. And that's the system that they had as they rose to prominence and success. The British said that system was racist and they had to get rid of it. And so that sparked the Unilateral Declaration of Independence in 1965, where Rhodesia, using language drawn from the American Declaration of Independence, broke away from the British Commonwealth and became a fully independent country. But except for Portugal, South Africa, and Israel, the rest of the world didn't legitimize that, didn't recognize it as a country. So it led to this Bush War from 1965 to 1980, where communist rebels that were backed by the Chinese and the Russians and also the Americans and British attacked Rhodesia and tried to end it and bring in Mugabe, who was a dictator. And it eventually ended in his victory.
Yeah, and I mean, that's just continued across Africa, the decolonization, if you will. I've looked into pretty extensively like what happened in South Africa, and I saw someone post just yesterday. I mean, it seems like the whole African continent is sort of under some sort of war at this point.
Yeah. Well, there's a spat in, I think, the Congo right now between the South African military and I think Bulgarian military on one hand and the Rwandans on the other, and the Rwandans just won. But it's terrible. And if you look at what happened there, and the Congo is another good example, there were ways to end the chaos very early on. And Mike Hoare, who you might have heard of, was a South African mercenary who, at the request of the Congolese government, kind of ended the Simba Rebellion and wanted to, after the rebellion ended, bring continued stability to the country. But the UN forced him out because it was a majority white militia or mercenary outfit. And they said, well, that's racist and you have to leave. And so then the Congo got 5 decades of civil war with millions of people dead because of that. And so it's very much the opposite of Singapore, where instead of these pragmatic policies, you get this race communism, essentially.
When I look at the Singapore example or the Dubai example, I mean, again, Singapore and Dubai seems to have set up a system that just sort of outcompeted. In Dubai, I mean, their immigration is very strict, right? Unless you're going to be a productive member of society, you're not invited. It's like an invite-only society. But at the same time, they don't have all that industrialization to protect, right? They don't have steel companies to protect. So, while on one hand, that type of government seems to make sense, and it certainly has worked on a small scale, as we can point to in Singapore, maybe Hong Kong to some extent, Dubai, et cetera. That doesn't necessarily apply apples to apples over to the U.S., right? Because the U.S. needs to be almost more protectionist of their industries that they have. I think that's what you were sort of alluding to earlier.
Yeah, I think the policies you get from that sort of government are different and tailored to local circumstances. One of Lee Kuan Yew's famous innovations was he put air conditioning in every government office so the bureaucrats would work in the afternoon instead of taking siestas. And it hugely boosted Singapore's governing capacity without having to bring on more people. You don't really need that in New York or London. It's not the same thing. But I do think if you look at, say, what's the similarity between Lee Kuan Yew and President McKinley, it's this non-ideological view of events and economics where they're going to take whatever step is necessary to protect the wealth of the nation and the stability of the nation, but do so because it will work. And there's a history of it working, not because some ideological belief told them they had to do it. I think that's the similarity.
When you talk about the colonies, as we just kind of talked about, it seems like everything in life that there's just trade-offs. Alex Gladstein, I'm sure you've come across his work plenty, and he is, 100% in it, thinking that the colonies are the worst thing in the world. And from his viewpoint and the things that he talks about, the way that the French used the CFA to, debase the currency, I get it. Those seem like really bad things. I can also see how there's also good things that happened, right? So they did bring civilization, technology, order to things that didn't have that before. So I think there's trade-offs. Maybe would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's good things about colonization, but there's also bad things. It can be misused and abused just like any other policy, probably for that matter. So, to the point of removing the colonization is like entropy, and now it's just into chaos and devolving into, mass disorder, which is not good. So I guess what I'd like to maybe just pivot into and sort of to wrap this up is, now you're well-versed in history. You've seen the differences of what happened with the French Revolution versus the American Revolution, all the way back to the Roman Empire and even Socrates, the way they think about this, and the colonization. You mentioned a couple times, sort of how democracy fails and the reasons for that. Obviously, America was founded as a republic, not a democracy.
Right.
I'm curious what you think to be sort of this way forward. Maybe first just for the United States, and then maybe how that fits into the world. And then maybe, I'm sure, since you're so well-read, you're probably also familiar with the sovereign individual thesis. And which way forward, and do you think maybe it goes in that direction?
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Okay, let's break it down.
Yeah. So the first thing in America is you have to stop the entropy. And I think that's often like the biggest hurdle because it has this vibe, for lack of a better word, of paternalism. You have to stop people from doing X or stop people from doing Y. So if you don't want, some woman lit on fire in the subway, as happened in New York recently, you don't want these like random attacks in the street, you don't want crime, that calls for a stronger stance against things. You don't necessarily need a bigger government. You don't necessarily need cameras on every street corner. They didn't have them in 1890. But you do need to have we're not going to deal with this approach to things, which I think is
actual punishment.
Yes, actual punishment. Whether
not
it's
like here in California where you can steal up to $1,000 without it being a crime.
Yeah, in Singapore they'll cane you, where they tie you to a ladder and hit you with a stick, and that works pretty well in terms of stopping this petty crime. Whatever it is, based on the country, you just have to find something where people aren't going to commit these crimes. The entropy is going to stop, and that I think we know how to do. We just don't want to do it. It's this tough on crime approach, whether you're putting people in jail like Bukele or hitting them with rods like in Singapore or something. The step after that is, I think, you need to get rid of the short-termism. These short time horizons have just proven devastating to society, particularly industrial ones, where you have to take these long-term steps to preserve and build the wealth of the nation. So how do you do that? That's really a situation thing. I think for companies, for example, because we talked about that earlier, you'd want to use probably the SEC guidance to encourage companies to think about, the health of the company both during and after the CEO's tenure for pay and pushing it out rather than just the short-termism. But, that's kind of up to companies and stuff. I think the bigger thing politically is finding ways to put limits on mass democracy that work with our culture. Ever since Jackson, we've been somewhat of a universal suffrage nation. That's worked okay in some regards. It definitely probably works okay for the House of Representatives. I do think the Senate is supposed to be different. So either removing the amendment about the Senate being a popular vote rather than state vote, or finding some way to do a new update or a new amendment about that, I think would be helpful. I think also you'd probably want to look at something about a new amendment for voting where only net taxpayers could vote. I mean, preferably we're not going to have the income tax, but if we are, you don't want the people who can loot the treasury doing so. You want to have the people who are contributing something on net to both the government.
Skin in the game.
Yeah, skin in the game, exactly.
Yeah. I've also thought that's like the easiest requirement. If you don't pay tax, you just shouldn't vote. Like just back to my homeowner example, if I don't live in the neighborhood anymore, if I don't own the home in the neighborhood, I probably shouldn't vote either.
Right. And you could kind of go down the rabbit hole of specificity with that, but I think broadly the mindset should be, how are we going to limit democracy somewhat so that we can bring about long-term thinking with whatever's going to work? I think the net taxpayer thing is probably the lowest hanging fruit, just because everyone who's a productive citizen agrees with that, more or less. Some don't, but most do. So there's that. I've talked about this with people before, and this is the much tougher question, but inculcating virtue in people, both just those who kind of exist and definitely those who lead, is an important thing. The Founding Fathers, after the Bible, the most common ancient work on their shelf was Plutarch's Lives. And Plutarch was a writer in early Empire Rome who discussed he called it the lives of the noble Romans and Grecians. And it was the great men of Greece and the great men of Rome, and discussing their character traits, both moral failings and moral virtues. And of course, their stance on morality was somewhat different in Rome than ours. But he discussed them, and if you still go back and read them, very useful. And that's a small example. But no school teaches Plutarch now, even though our founding fathers, when they wrote our Constitution and built our government, they were doing it with Plutarch in mind.
And that's because you can't legislate morality.
Right. But you can teach it, I think. Right. So our education system is flawed in many ways. I do think you voluntarily want to teach people to have the right morals, and everyone has a different opinion on right morals, but I think, generally this idea of stewardship and of duty and sacrifice are good things for people to think of.
Because do you think that's also like that point? I heard Jordan Peterson talk about that. So like countries built on Judeo-Christian principles have that self-sacrifice built in, which is why somebody may get out at 5 a.m. or 3 a.m. in a hurricane to go fix a power line, where in another country maybe they wouldn't do that. But also, early in America too, people went to church and people gave to the church, and the church took care of the needy. And today, without that, it seems like a lot of people expect the state to take care of the needy.
Right. Well, and that's another opportunity for reform that I think would be helpful. So you have the virtue angle, but then you just have the practicality of it. I was talking with someone yesterday about, Trump is trying to slash, I forget if it's WIC or one of the other food stamp programs, but he says it's just abused. We need to get rid of it. There are different opinions on that, but I think it's very true that it's abused. Yeah, people have known about this for ages, the ways you're able to get around it and use it to put money in your pocket. So, what separates that from a food bank is that the food bank is generally run by a church or some other organization that cares about the community. It's all local, where it's local people drawing from it and contributing to it. So there's these ties that bind, people in the community. And so it's limited. They're not just going to keep giving you pasta to sell to buy cigarettes with. They're going to, expect you to feed your family with it. And what that does is it gets rid of this concept of just philanthropy as this broad exercise where once you contribute the money, you don't have to worry about it, whether it's tax dollars or whether it's giving $1 billion to some African country for mosquito nets. They're just going to use for fishing and overfish. Instead, it's more noblesse oblige. It's this older system that you have a duty to those around you, and you should be attached to the people in your community and do what you can for them. And so, whether it's church or whether it's something secular and just built around making it work, as a Christian, I'd say the church is more useful for this. But
the problem is most secular people don't have that self-sacrifice initiative.
Right. Yeah. There's a host of problems.
Yeah.
With that.
Okay.
But I think drawing things in locally, kind of what we were talking about earlier with what changes you need to make, I do think localism will be helpful because every community's needs are different and also the opportunities there are different. So taking things away from the federal government's ability to dictate them and putting them in the hands of local people of prominence, I think would be hugely helpful, both on the charity and self-sacrifice angle, but then also on making America prosperous again.
Yeah. So I want to ask you the question of which way forward, but based off of all of that, it sounds like you still have a lot of hope for the future.
I do. I think a lot of people blackfill. They just have this sense of doom, which if you're in somewhere like Spain or France, that might be closer to reality. I think still have a debt, everything. They're going to have a lot of trouble. But I think in America, we still, just because our society became so prosperous and just effective and really good at things, we have this vast store of capital that we're able to draw down and build on. And we've been in the drawdown stage for a while. That's why things are getting worse. That's why, as you mentioned, the roads are just awful everywhere. And you can't go to the mall because you'll get shot. But it can also be built upon. We have all these things where, we had an effective society. We have all the remnants of it. We just need to rebuild it in a different way that works better than the last one did. But I think in America, we should certainly have hope that a lot of these things can be improved and fixed. And once we fix them and kind of move forward, I think there's a good reason for hope.
So then moving forward, we'll finish it up with this. I threw out the sovereign individual thesis. And so for those that don't know, it's a book written, and you should certainly read that book. I like it. It's sort of my worldview. But it sort of paints this picture back to kind of going into this information age of us being able to sort of move more globally, if you will, because we're in cyberspace, not being tied down as much to one local area like we kind of talked about, like the old lords of the past that had their land in the local area. But it also talked about structure of small, sort of entrepreneurial-driven, skin-in-the-game localities or small governments, if you will. Maybe not unlike what the United States was meant to be at some point in its founding. What do you think the way forward is?
I think one kind of issue with framing of just that thesis generally is we've tried the atomized individual thing. And it works out very poorly for a lot of people. There are some people who thrive in that circumstance, but you also get a lot of deaths of despair, and people like having a community to which they're attached. And now that doesn't mean you need a big government. That doesn't mean you need all the trappings we have now. But I do think that, at least for most people, some degree of community is a useful exercise and something that they want. So then I think the question becomes, how do you build community in a way that you're both self-sovereign and the community is sovereign? And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Balaji, I won't try pronouncing his last name, Srinivasan, wrote that book, The Network
State.
Yeah. And I do think the concept of city-states of the future, Singapore and Dubai, of course, are city-states, is a very useful one because those are bigger city-states. But the community that can be built and the sovereignty that can be built by building a new prosperous place, I think is something that we're going to see more of. Prospera is trying to figure it out off the coast of Honduras, I think, and there's seasteading and some other things. I think that free cities type thing is something that really helped Europe get its way out of the Middle Ages and is something that would help us now with kind of our present dark age. So I don't think it's individual atomization, but I do think the breaking up of some of these old calcified states and forms is going to be both going to happen and going to be useful as it happens.
Yeah, not the individual to the person thesis, but just like, as I said, sort of like, the U.S. is 50 independent states as opposed to now everything being federal, right? Where now 330 million people live under one regime where we're supposed to be sort of like one state. And then even to the point where the states have gotten way bigger and probably should have been cut up at some point even as well, right? So, and then maybe going back to like a county structure, almost, if you will, right?
Well, yeah, and that's one thing people forget. It's clear, though, if you read works of the time, that the county was the unit people depended on. Gone with the Wind is that famous book about Civil War Georgia. But in it, they rarely talk about the state. They never talk about either of the national governments. It's the county. What are people in the county doing to mobilize? What's county leadership looking like? Who are the men of note in the county? And that condenses things locally where it's a useful thing to care about because you know about the problem children, you know about the people of note. It's more useful and more manageable as a human. And, the information age has expanded the ability to be useful somewhat, but I still think there are only so many things you can keep track of, even with computers.
Do you think that Bitcoin can sort of help to shape, I would say, but maybe even force that a little bit, right? Where like if it does, what I think is sort of maybe separating money and state, which would then sort of limit the state's never-ending ability to grow, then it sort of sets constraints on what they're able to do.
Yeah, I think it's hopeful. I think the problem with relying on it completely is that Prussia existed during the gold standard era, as did the Tsar's Russia. And I know those are different. The gold standard's different from Bitcoin, but tyranny can still exist in a hard money world. I think what's the most useful or most hopeful thing about Bitcoin is, as you're talking about with your neighborhood, the ability to vote with your feet and say, I'm done with this. I'm not putting up with it anymore. Because it's the perfect bearer asset where you can just leave.
Yeah, but the thing was like Prussia and just wars and tyranny with the gold standard is like to the point that you made earlier about the lords of old. Like I couldn't just get up and leave with all my wealth. Mm-hmm. So then I was certainly under that thumb of tyranny, as well as if you came and took me over, you also took all my wealth.
Right.
So that made the return, as the sovereign individual would say, right, the return on violence is very high.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But if you can't come and take me over and take my wealth, or if I could just leave and take my wealth with me, then it makes the return on violence very low.
Right. I think there's something there. I think you're right. I think, the barons, for example, if you read about the Plantagenet kings in England, so kind of up to the 1400s, there's all these barons' wars where the king would try and take something and they'd say, well, we're not doing this, we're going to fight. I think kind of how gold and silver enabled that at the time, because if you pay mercenaries with gold or silver and you know them or it's people that rely on you, there's not really anything an outside force can do about that. They can try and stop you, but that's different from saying, as happens with credit cards or cash now, you can't do that, we're going to stop you before you do it. I think Bitcoin is kind of helpful, like you're talking about, and that even if someone comes for you, they can't mess with you in the same way they can with cash. So I think it's very useful, and I think it's hopeful for liberty moving forward. I think the ways we'll see it play out are probably going to be unexpected, at least from what I'm thinking about. But I think these city-states are going to be powered by Bitcoin, powered by just similar type things that take, as you said, money out of the state's hands.
Yeah. All right, Will, we covered a lot of ground. That's super fascinating. I love history. Not near as much as you do, but hopefully everybody thought this was as interesting as I did. I'm certainly going to link to a bunch of your writing down below in the show notes down below so people can get caught up and read your stuff. Anything that you want to point their attention to specifically?
Yeah, if you go to either my Twitter or my Substack, which will probably be linked up, just the top articles that are on there are where I've written about this stuff the most. So if anything interested you, it's probably on there too. And, you can just find more about it. Contact me through Twitter.
All right. Thanks so much, Will.
Yep, thanks for having me on.